The sweet taste of lead paint chips was something your parents never warned you about, because nobody warned them. Before regulators, before lawsuits, before the truth caught up to the prophets, the American home was a gallery of beautiful, quietly lethal objects. Here are 30 items found in 1950s homes that are now illegal. Lead-based paint covered the walls of virtually every American home built before 1958, and manufacturers knew it was dangerous long before the public did. The Dutch Boy Paint Company had internal research dating back to the 1920s showing that lead dust caused neurological damage in kids. They kept that research internal. The paint itself was prized for its durability and chalky finish. Kids touched and leaned against those walls, and when the paint began to dry and peel into thin chips, children often put those chips in their mouths. Lead tastes sweet, and that sweetness drew kids back. The federal government did not ban residential lead paint until 1978, meaning an entire generation grew up absorbing a neurotoxin that permanently altered brain development. No mass recall, no notification program. Just a quiet regulatory change, decades after the damage was done. Asbestos ceiling tiles lined the living rooms and kitchens of nearly every post-war American home, praised by builders as the perfect material, fireproof, cheap, and easy to cut with a standard utility knife. That utility knife was the problem. Every time a homeowner trimmed a tile, drilled through it to hang a fixture, or cracked an aging floor tile underfoot, the cut edges released chrysotile fibers into the air, thin enough to pass through a dust mask and lodge permanently in lung tissue. Johns Manville, the largest asbestos manufacturer in the country, had company physicians documenting asbestosis cases among workers as early as 1934. They continued selling asbestos tiles to American families for 4 more decades. The EPA did not fully ban chrysotile, the most common form, until March of 2024. The tiles in your parents' finished basement may still be there, waiting for a renovation that sends the fibers airborne. DDT was the miracle pesticide America sprayed inside its own homes throughout the 1950s, sold in pump canisters, marketed to housewives under names like Flit and Insecto Blitz, with cheerful advertisements showing mothers fogging their kitchens before dinner. The compound dichlorodiphenyl-trichloroethane had been celebrated since World War II for stopping typhus and malaria overseas. The transition from battlefield to kitchen cabinet was seamless and completely unregulated. Families sprayed it on counters, on mattresses, on nursery walls. The chemical accumulated in fatty tissue, passed through breast milk, and concentrated up the food chain. Rachel Carson documented the mechanism in her 1962 book, Silent Spring. The Environmental Protection Agency banned DDT for domestic uses in 1972, 27 years after American households had been routinely misting it across their dinner tables. The canisters sat next to the salt and pepper. Nobody told you to wash your hands. The radium alarm clock on your grandparents' bedside table was a low-grade radiation source they slept beside every night for years. Radium-painted dials, produced by the United States Radium Corporation throughout the 1940s and 50s, used radium-226 mixed with zinc sulfide to create a glow that required no battery. By 1963, an estimated 10 million radium watches and clocks were still in active use across the country. Each emitted alpha, beta, and gamma radiation continuously. At close range, a bedside table 2 feet from a sleeping face, individual dose rates could reach 310 millirem per year. The manufacturers understood the risk. The radium girls, factory workers who painted those same dials, had died of bone cancer and jaw necrosis in the 1920s and 30s, their bodies so saturated with radium that they glowed. That information was available. The clocks kept selling. Radium was not removed from consumer watch dials until the early 1970s. If your 1950s home had termites, the exterminator injected chlordane under the foundation and into the soil around the perimeter. An amber organochlorine compound guaranteed to eliminate termites for 20 years. It kept that promise. The EPA estimates chlordane was applied to approximately 30 million American homes between 1948 and 1988. The problem was that chlordane did not stay under the foundation. It volatilized through concrete slabs and subfloor material, rising as an invisible, odorless vapor. Residents reported headaches, dizziness, and tremors for years without understanding why. Government tests of U.S. military housing, conducted 32 years after treatment, found indoor air levels 10 to 15 times above safe levels set by the CDC. The EPA banned all uses of chlordane in 1988. In soil, its half-life is up to 30 years. Homes treated in 1960 are still off-gassing today. Carbon tetrachloride was the active ingredient in Carbona cleaning fluid and dozens of other American spot removers sold throughout the 1950s, kept under kitchen sinks and in laundry rooms across the country. It dissolved grease, ink, and set in stains without scrubbing. What the label omitted was that inhaling its fumes in a closed room caused direct liver and kidney damage, and skin contact allowed the chemical to absorb through the dermis into the bloodstream. The Consumer Product Safety Commission banned carbon tetrachloride from consumer products in 1970, after 2 decades as a laundry room staple. Before the ban, housewives used it in unventilated rooms with bare hands while children played nearby. It was also the active ingredient in certain household fire extinguishers, and if you discharged one of those extinguishers in an enclosed garage, the heat from the fire converted the carbon tetrachloride into phosgene gas. That is the same chemical weapon deployed in World War I. Physohex was the antibacterial cleanser American hospitals used to bathe newborns throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, and it was the same product family people bought over the counter to wash their babies at home. Its active ingredient, hexachlorophene at 3%, was marketed as the gold standard of germ elimination. Winthrop Laboratories tested the compound on baby monkeys in the early 1970s, bathing them daily for 90 days. Every animal developed brain lesions. The FDA warned 600,000 doctors in 1971, but did not act on consumer products for another year. In 1972, a manufacturing error in France produced baby powder with 6% hexachlorophene, killing 39 infants and damaging the central nervous systems of hundreds more. The FDA then restricted hexachlorophene to prescription use. Menon's Baby Magic Bath had already been recalled the prior year. Dial soap, which had branded the compound as its secret ingredient, AT7, and advertised that it clung to your skin for days, quietly reformulated after 2 decades. The mercury thermometer was standard in every American medicine cabinet throughout the 1950s, sis. A slender glass tube that parents pressed under feverish kids' tongues and read by tilting toward light. Mercury is one of the most potent neurological toxins in nature. A single clinical thermometer held between 1/2 and 1 gram of the liquid metal, enough if the glass broke and the mercury vaporized in a warm, closed room, to trigger hazardous materials protocols under current EPA guidelines. Kids bit through glass thermometers routinely. Parents wiped up the visible beads and considered the matter handled. The liquid that rolled under radiators and baseboards continued to vaporize for months. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommended against mercury thermometers in 1999. Multiple states have since banned their sale. The thermometers were never recalled from homes where they already sat, meaning millions remained in medicine cabinets for decades after the medical community had concluded they were a household hazard. The brilliant orange-red Fiestaware plates on your grandmother's kitchen shelves were radioactive. Homer Laughlin China Company began producing Fiestaware in 1936 using uranium oxide in the glaze, a fact never printed on the box. Between 1959 and 1969, an estimated 2 million pieces of uranium-glazed dinnerware were manufactured and sold across the country. A 1981 study by the New York State Health Department found Fiestaware emitted radioactivity above federal guidelines and that the uranium glaze flaked off when in contact with acidic foods such as vinegar dressings, fruit juice, and sauerkraut. The flakes were ingested with the meal. In 1942, the U.S. government suspended Fiestaware's iconic red color because the uranium was needed for the Manhattan Project. Production resumed in 1958. Nobody thought to ask what that implication meant for families eating off the plates daily. The EPA now specifically advises against using pre-1973 Fiestaware for food or drink. Lead solder sealed the copper water pipe joints of virtually every American home built before 1986, an industry standard because it melted at low temperature and created a reliable, watertight seal. What it also did was leach lead into the water. Every time water sat in those pipes overnight and then ran in the morning into coffee pots or cooking water, it carried dissolved lead at concentrations that varied with the age of the pipes and the acidity of the local water supply. The Safe Drinking Water Act was amended in 1986 to ban lead solder in new plumbing. It did not require existing pipes to be replaced. An estimated 6 to 10 million lead service lines remain in the ground across the United States today. The pipes soldered in the 1950s are still delivering water to kitchen taps with no warning label. In older homes, the only way to know the lead content of your drinking water is to test it yourself. Most families never do. In the late 1970s, following the energy crisis, hundreds of thousands of American homeowners insulated their walls with urea formaldehyde foam, pumped through small holes drilled in exterior walls, where it expanded to fill every cavity. Contractors called it a permanent solution. The Consumer Product Safety Commission received more than 2,200 complaints from homeowners after installation, representing over 5,700 individuals reporting eye irritation, respiratory problems, headaches, and nausea. The CPSC voted 4-1 to ban UFFI from residential use in 1982, citing unreasonable carcinogenic risk from continuous formaldehyde off-gassing. What made it particularly insidious was that the foam did not stop emitting formaldehyde after curing. Research later showed it continued releasing low-level fumes for decades as it crumbled inside the walls. Homeowners had paid contractors to seal a slow-release carcinogen permanently into their home structure. Some sold at a fraction of market value rather than pay to re-insulate every wall. General Electric and Westinghouse filled the ballasts of fluorescent light fixtures. The fixtures in nearly every American kitchen, basement, and garage in the 1950s, with polychlorinated biphenyls manufactured by Monsanto under the trade name Aerochlor. PCBs were excellent electrical insulators and virtually fireproof. They were also, as Monsanto's own internal research showed by 1969, highly toxic and indestructible in the environment, accumulating in fatty tissue, crossing the placenta, passing through breast milk, and linking to cancer and immune suppression. Monsanto formed an internal crisis management committee that year to contain the public relations consequences while continuing production. General Electric discharged approximately 1.3 million pounds of PCBs into the Hudson River between 1947 and 1977. Congress banned PCB manufacturing in 1979. The ballasts above your family's kitchen table were saturated with the compound. When the fixtures failed and went into the trash, The PCBs went with them. Benzene was the active solvent in spot removers and dry cleaning fluids sold in American homes throughout the 1950s. Products like Carbona and K2R sat in laundry rooms alongside the washing machine and were used without gloves to treat stained fabric before laundering. The chemical was extraordinarily effective at dissolving grease and oil because it attacked hydrocarbon bonds directly. It attacked human DNA the same way. Long-term benzene exposure is one of the most well-established causes of leukemia and other blood cancers in medical literature. That link was already documented in occupational studies by the 1940s. The housewives dabbing it onto shirt collars in unventilated laundry rooms were not told. Neither were the kids who wandered in while the bottle was open. Benzene has since been banned or heavily restricted in cleaning agents. The brands that used it reformulated quietly, without announcements, without recalls, and without reaching out to the families who had spent years applying it to fabric with bare hands in closed rooms. Before the 1970s, the standard finish on wooden baby cribs was lead-based paint, the same formula used on interior walls, applied to the rails that infants spent hours pressing their mouths against. Lead paint was prized for its durability and the bright, vivid colors it produced. On a crib rail, those qualities translated directly into a delivery mechanism. Infants chewed the rails, and the paint flaked into their mouths in pieces thin enough to swallow without choking. The federal government did not ban lead paint in residential use, including on cribs and children's furniture, until 1978. By that point, researchers had already established that there is no safe level of lead exposure in children, that even low-level absorption causes irreversible neurological damage, and that the effects on IQ and behavioral development are permanent. The cribs were never recalled. Parents who had painted them with hardware store lead paint were never notified. The damage by then had already registered in a generation of young ones who would never know why. Asbestos oven mitts and ironing board covers were standard kitchen equipment throughout the 1950s, sold at hardware stores and department stores as the sensible fireproof choice for handling hot pans and for pressing clothes. The asbestos fibers were woven directly into the fabric of the mitt, giving it genuine heat resistance that cotton could not match. The problem was wear. Every time the mitt was flexed, compressed around a hot pan handle, or laundered, the outer fabric abraded and microscopic chrysotile fibers were released into the kitchen air. Ironing board covers shed fibers with every pass of the iron. The women who used these products daily, ironing shirts, pulling roasts from the oven, handling them in the ordinary rhythm of housekeeping, were inhaling asbestos in their own kitchens without a single warning label to suggest they should not. No federal agency restricted asbestos in consumer textile products until well into the 1970s. By then, the latency period for mesothelioma, 15 to 50 years, meant the damage was already running its silent clock. Pentachlorophenol, sold under brand names like Penta and used to treat fence posts, utility poles, and wooden structural timbers, was one of the most common wood preservatives in American backyards throughout the 1950s, and one of the most toxic compounds a child could press bare hands against on a sunny afternoon. The treated wood had a distinctive dark, oily surface and a sharp chemical smell that faded after a few weeks in the weather, leaving no visible warning of what was still there. Pentachlorophenol absorbs through skin on contact, and it is laced with dioxins, the same class of compounds responsible for the contamination at Times Beach, Missouri. Kids climbed treated fence posts, sat on treated rails, and built forts from treated lumber scraps. The EPA severely restricted pentachlorophenol for residential use in 1984 and required it to be applied only by certified applicators. The compound's half-life in soil is measured in decades. Fence posts treated in the 1950s are still leaching dioxin-contaminated preservative into the soil beside them. On summer evenings throughout the 1950s, The DDT fogging truck rolled slowly through American neighborhoods. It was a flatbed vehicle that trailed thick white clouds of dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane at ground level, and kids ran through the fog the way they ran through lawn sprinklers. Parents watched from porches and considered it entertainment. Public health officials promoted it as a civic good, a modern miracle of science, defeating the mosquito. The trucks operated in residential neighborhoods from coast to coast, fogging streets, yards, and the open windows of houses. Children ran directly through concentrated DDT clouds, breathing and absorbing the compound through exposed skin. This was not an accident or a misuse. This was the intended application, conducted with the full endorsement of local health departments. The Environmental Protection Agency banned DDT in 1972. The fogging trucks had been running through American neighborhoods for 20 years before that. No one ever told the children who ran through those clouds what they had inhaled. The Buck Rogers atomic pistol ring, sold as a novelty toy through comic book advertisements and dime stores throughout the early 1950s, contained a small chamber of polonium-210, an actual radioactive material that produced visible scintillation flashes when viewed through a tiny lens. The manufacturer, Sayre Premium Sales Company, sold it to kids for 50 cents with box tops. Children wore it on their fingers for hours, pressing the polonium chamber against their skin, and they peered directly into the lens at point-blank range. Polonium-210 is the same substance used to poison Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006. The ring was sold without a single warning, without any regulatory review, and it was never recalled. By the time public attitudes toward radioactivity shifted in the mid-1950s, an unknown number of rings had already been sold to an unknown number of kids across the country, and nobody went looking for them. Wooden toys sold throughout the 1950s. Painted trains, alphabet blocks, pull toys, rocking horses were finished with paints containing cadmium and lead pigments because those compounds produced the vivid reds, yellows, and oranges that made the toys appealing to kids and durable in warehouses. Cadmium produces an intense, stable yellow-orange. It is also a known human carcinogen that accumulates in the kidneys and causes bone loss with prolonged exposure. The paints were applied to surfaces kids put in their mouths constantly, and the manufacturers knew the toys would be chewed. No federal standard regulated heavy metal content in children's toy paint until the Consumer Product Safety Commission established limits in the 1970s. Before those limits existed, the bright paint on the wooden train set under your Christmas tree in 1953 contained compounds that no regulatory body had ever required anyone to disclose, test, or limit. The toys looked cheerful. The chemistry underneath was not. Dial soap ran national advertising campaigns throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, built around a single selling point. Its secret ingredient, AT7, would cling to your skin and keep killing bacteria for days after you stepped out of the shower. AT7 was hexachlorophene, a neurotoxic compound that the Food and Drug Administration restricted in 1972 after killing infants in France. But for over 20 years before that restriction, Dial marketed hexachlorophene-laced soap to the entire American family, to fathers, mothers, and children, for daily use, applied to the full surface area of the body, and specifically advertised as a compound that stayed on the skin and accumulated over repeated washings. That accumulation was the mechanism of harm. Hexachlorophene absorbs through skin, builds up in fatty tissue, and reaches the central nervous system. The cheerful clock printed on the Dial bar, the brand's logo during that era, did not appear on the Food and Drug Administration's warning letters. The soap did. The asbestos brake pads in every American car built through the 1950s and 60s produced a fine gray dust when worn down through normal stopping. That dust settled on the garage floor, on the driveway, and on the hands and clothing of anyone who worked on the brakes at home. The fine-grade dust coated everything. Home mechanics, the fathers and older sons who replaced brake pads on the family Chevrolet in the driveway on weekends, were handling and breathing raw asbestos dust without protective equipment because nobody told them they needed any. The dust tracked from the garage into the kitchen on the soles of work boots. Chrysotile fibers from brake work are short and thin enough to remain suspended in still air for hours. Asbestos in automotive brake pads was not phased out until the late 1980s. The men who spent their Saturday afternoons underneath cars in the 1950s carried those fibers in their lung tissue for the rest of their lives. American food cans were sealed with lead solder from the mid-19th century through the early 1990s. A 140-year run during which every family that opened a can of tomatoes, peaches, or condensed soup consumed trace amounts of dissolved lead along with the contents. The lead solder formed a thick seam along the inside of the can's side joint. Acidic foods, such as tomatoes, fruit, and citrus products, actively accelerated leaching. Studies conducted before the phase-out found measurable lead concentrations in canned food, with the highest levels in products that had sat on shelves for months. The FDA began phasing out lead-soldered food cans in the late 1980s and completed the transition in 1995. The cans your parents stocked in the pantry throughout the 1950s contained the lead seam as a standard manufacturing feature. It appeared on no label. No warning was ever issued to American families about the cans already on their shelves. The original Saran wrap your mother pulled from the box in the 1950s was made from polyvinylidene chloride, a compound containing approximately 13% vinyl chloride, a known human carcinogen. Ralph Wiley discovered the material at Dow Chemical in Michigan, and the company adapted it for kitchen use without disclosing its chemistry to the families wrapping leftovers in it. The plastic clung tightly because of its chloride-dense molecular structure, the same structure that made it a carcinogen when it migrated into food. Heat accelerated migration. Covering a hot dish with plastic wrap before refrigerating sent the compound directly into the food surface. Dow reformulated Saran wrap to polyethylene decades later after consumer concern mounted. The reformulated version does not cling as well. The reason the original clung so effectively was never explained on the box. The wall thermostat in nearly every American home built through the 1950s and 60s contained a mercury tilt switch, a sealed glass capsule holding liquid mercury that completed the heating circuit when the capsule tilted and the bead rolled across two electrical contacts. They were accurate and reliable, and often placed on the wall of every room at a height children could reach. When old thermostats were thrown in household trash, a standard practice for decades, the capsule shattered in landfills and mercury leached into soil and groundwater. The EPA estimates thermostat switches account for millions of pounds of mercury released through improper disposal. Many states have since banned the sale of mercury thermostats. Millions remain installed in older American homes today. Their sealed glass capsules are aging behind plastic faceplates. Early electric hair dryers sold throughout the 1950s used asbestos as the primary heat insulation inside the casing. Sheets of compressed chrysotile fiber were wrapped around the heating element to keep the plastic shell from melting. As the dryer aged, the insulation shifted and shed fibers. Those fibers traveled through the heating element and out the nozzle with the hot air. You aimed the nozzle at your head. The Environmental Protection Agency identified asbestos in hair dryers as a consumer health concern in the late 1970s and issued guidance recommending against using dryers manufactured before 1980. The Consumer Product Safety Commission estimated approximately 3 million asbestos-containing hair dryers were in use in American homes at the time. No mandatory recall was issued. Families were asked politely to stop using them. Lead acetate hair dye, sold under brand names, including Grecian formula throughout the 1960s and beyond, darkened gray hair through repeated application, depositing lead sulfide crystals into the hair shaft. The darkening mechanism was also an absorption mechanism. Lead acetate transfers from fingertips to every surface touched during application: the scalp, the bathroom counter, the doorknob, the hand towel shared by the family. Men who used it daily were absorbing lead through their skin with every session. The EU banned lead acetate in cosmetics in 2018. The FDA did not ban it in the United States until 2022, more than 60 years after Grecian formula first appeared on American drugstore shelves and long after multiple generations had applied it to their scalps and to everything they touched afterward. Radithor was a patent medicine sold in the late 1920s, a glass vial of water laced with radium-226 and radium-228, marketed as a cure for fatigue and chronic illness at $1 a vial. The most documented casualty was Eben Byers, a Pittsburgh socialite who consumed approximately 1,400 vials on a physician's advice. By 1932, his jaw had collapsed, holes had opened in his skull, and his body weight had dropped below 90 pounds. The Wall Street Journal ran his obituary under the headline, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off." Radithor was pulled from the market, but radium-infused products, heating pads, bath salts, and compressed ore tablets continued reaching American families by mail order into the 1950s, without prescription and without any federal agency raising an objection. Chlordane was sprayed onto American front and back lawns throughout the 1950s and 60s as a standard pest control application by homeowners from garden sprayers, by lawn companies from pressurized tanks, and by municipal crews across suburban neighborhoods. Children played on those lawns barefoot within hours of application. The chlordane soaked into the soil and stayed. Its half-life was between 20 and 30 years. Lawns treated in 1958 were still holding measurable concentrations into the 1980s, long after the EPA had banned it. A 1987 EPA estimate found as many as 52 million Americans remained exposed through contaminated soil and indoor air. The children who played barefoot in those yards are in their 70s now. Some of them still do not know. The drinking water in millions of American homes ran through lead service lines from the municipal main to the house, pipes that were standard in cities since the late 19th century, installed because lead was cheap and durable. The Safe Drinking Water Act was amended in 1986 to ban new lead service lines, but it did not require existing ones to be replaced. In 2016, the crisis in Flint, Michigan, exposed what that gap looked like. A city's children absorbed lead through their drinking water because the corrosion treatment that kept lead from leaching was discontinued to save money. The EPA currently estimates between 6 and 10 million lead service lines remain in the ground across the United States. Families and homes built in the 1950s are still drawing water through them. There is no label on the tap that says so. The fluorescent lights in the classrooms and cafeterias of American schools built through the 1950s and 70s contained ballasts filled with polychlorinated biphenyls, the same Monsanto-manufactured Aerochlor that GE and Westinghouse had installed in residential fixtures. In schools, the exposure was concentrated. Children spent 6 hours a day, 9 months a year, in rooms where aging ballasts slowly leaked polychlorinated biphenyls into ceiling tiles and the air. The Toxic Substances Control Act banned the manufacture of polychlorinated biphenyls in 1979, but it did not require schools to remove equipment already installed. Lawsuits against districts and manufacturers are still being filed. The kids who sat beneath those lights for 12 years of schooling are adults now. Monsanto's Internal Crisis Committee, formed in 1969 when the company's own research confirmed the danger, decided the public relations problem was manageable. The liability problem is still being sorted out in courtrooms more than 50 years later. They knew, in case after case, the memos existed and the product kept shipping anyway. If this made you angry, subscribe. There is more.